There is a white scar on the canyon walls at Hoover Dam that is 170 feet tall. It marks every foot of water that entered Lake Mead and never came back. As of this week, the lake sits at 29% of its total capacity. 40 million Americans depend on what is left, and the Bureau of Reclamation is projecting it will drop another 20 feet before summer ends. This is not a future crisis, this is a current one. The white ring and what it actually means. If you have seen photographs of Lake Mead in the last decade, you have seen the bathtub ring. Most people understand it as a visual marker of how low the lake has gotten. What most people do not understand is the precision of what it records. The pale white band coating the canyon walls is calcium carbonate, a mineral deposited by water as it evaporates. Every foot of that crust marks the exact elevation where the water surface once sat. It is geology functioning as a measurement instrument that cannot be adjusted, revised, or disputed. The ring currently stretches 170 feet above the lake's surface. That means the water visible in aerial photographs taken at the reservoir's highest point in 1983, when Lake Mead reached 1,225 feet above sea level and spillways had to be opened to prevent overtopping, sat 170 feet above the surface that exists today. That is the height of a 17-story building, now rising as empty air and white mineral crust above a lake that was engineered to be permanent. Lake Mead at full capacity holds approximately 26.1 million acre-feet of water. 1 acre-foot is enough to supply 2 average American households for an entire year. At current levels, the reservoir holds roughly 7.7 million acre-feet. The lake has lost more than 2/3 of its designed storage capacity, and it is losing more every week. The Bureau of Reclamation confirmed in its April 2026 24-month study that Lake Mead is projected to reach a record low elevation of 1,036 feet sometime in 2026. That would shatter the previous record set in 2022. This week's data shows the lake is already nearly 13 feet below where it stood at this time last year. Where the water comes from and why it is not coming back. To understand why Lake Mead is dying, you have to understand where its water originates. The Colorado River, the sole source feeding Lake Mead, is not sustained by groundwater. It is not replenished by tidal exchange or underground aquifers. The Colorado River runs almost entirely on snowpack. Every winter, snow accumulates across the Rocky Mountains of Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and northern New Mexico at elevations above 8,000 feet. In spring, that snow melts slowly, releasing water downstream through a river system that eventually reaches Lake Mead. That is the entire supply chain. Snow falls, snow melts, water flows, lake fills. That system is failing. Snowpack across the upper Colorado River basin as of late winter 2026 measured just 20% of its long-term average. The April through July inflow forecast for Lake Powell, the reservoir immediately upstream from Lake Mead, is approximately 800,000 acre-feet. That figure represents 13% of the historical average for that period, and is the lowest projected inflow ever recorded. The mountain snowpack that is supposed to fill the Colorado River every spring is nearly gone before it arrives. And here is what makes the situation structurally worse than a single bad winter. It is not just that less snow is falling. The timing has shifted. Warming temperatures across the American West cause snowpack to melt weeks earlier than historical averages. Water that once accumulated in frozen suspension across high mountain terrain through April and May is now melting in February and March, running off rapidly, evaporating at higher rates in warmer air, and failing to translate into reservoir storage before the summer heat consumes it. The river system's infrastructure was not designed to capture early runoff at this scale. The water arrives before the system is positioned to hold it and disappears before it reaches Lake Mead. The numbers that document this shift are unambiguous. Average snowpack in the upper Colorado River Basin has declined by more than 30% since 1980. The period from 2000 to the present is now documented by NASA, the United States Geological Survey, and multiple university research programs as the driest 23-year span the American Southwest has experienced in at least 1,200 years. Not a bad decade, not a rough stretch. The driest sustained period in more than a millennium. Researchers studying paleoclimate data through tree ring analysis now believe the wet conditions of the early 20th century were the anomaly, not the drought. The river the American West built its future on was measured during a historically exceptional wet period, and it was assumed to be normal. It was not normal then. The current conditions may be the actual long-term baseline reasserting itself. The people who lose everything. 40 million people. That number appears in every Lake Mead briefing document. It represents the Americans across 7 states who depend on Colorado River water for municipal supply, agricultural irrigation, industrial use, or hydroelectric power. The scale of that dependency is difficult to absorb until you break it into specific communities and specific consequences. Las Vegas, Nevada draws 90% of its municipal water supply directly from Lake Mead. The Southern Nevada Water Authority has spent more than $3 billion since 2000 on infrastructure designed to access water at progressively lower lake elevations. They drilled new intake tunnels deep into the lake floor. They built low lake pumping facilities specifically engineered for crisis conditions. They implemented the most aggressive mandatory water conservation program of any major American city, paying residents to remove grass, banning decorative water features, and restricting outdoor irrigation to 2 days per week. They did all of it. The lake still dropped. Across the Colorado River system, farmers who hold water rights dating back decades are receiving fractions of their allocated supplies. In 2024, some agricultural water right holders in Arizona and Nevada received 60% of their allocation. In 2025, those figures dropped further. Crops that depend on guaranteed water volumes cannot adapt to 50% delivery. Mortgages do not adjust to drought. The Navajo Nation faces the situation in its starkest form. 40% of Navajo Nation residents have no running water in their homes. They rely on hauled water, community collection points, and wells drawing from the same overtaxed aquifer system connected to the Colorado River Basin. As the basin depletes, the hauling distances grow and the collection points become less reliable. There is no backup infrastructure. There is no alternative system standing by. The people who were here before the Colorado River Compact was written in 1922 are among those who will feel its failure most directly. In Phoenix, a metropolitan area of 6 million people with growth projections adding more than 1 million additional residents by 2040, city planners are running emergency scenario modeling that officials describe as producing conclusions they were not prepared for. The century-long miscalculation, the story of Lake Mead's collapse, does not begin in 2026. It begins in 1922 in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where representatives of 7 western states gathered to divide the Colorado River. The Colorado River Compact that emerged from those negotiations is one of the most consequential and most catastrophically flawed documents in American history. The negotiators allocated 16 million acre-feet of water annually between the 7 basin states. That figure was based on river flow measurements taken between 1905 and 1922, a period that paleoclimate research now confirms was among the wettest the Colorado River Basin had experienced in more than 400 years. The delegates were dividing a river at a historically exceptional high water mark and treating that measurement as the permanent reliable baseline. The actual average annual flow of the Colorado River since 2000 has been approximately 12.3 million acre-feet. The compact allocated 16 million acre-feet of a river that delivers 12 million acre-feet. That gap of nearly 4 million acre-feet accumulates as a deficit every single year. It has been accumulating for more than 2 decades. It is sitting at the bottom of a falling lake. Hoover Dam was completed in 1935, an engineering achievement celebrated as the permanent solution to Western water insecurity. The reservoir behind it was designed to store 2 full years of average river flow as a buffer against drought. At the time, that seemed like an overwhelming margin of safety. The mega drought that began around 2000 was was expected to last a few years. It has not ended in 26 years. The compact, the dam, the cities, the farms, the 40 million people who came after. All of it was built on a foundational calculation made by men in a room in 1922 who looked at an exceptionally wet river and assumed they were seeing a normal one. Nobody in the decades that followed wanted to revisit that calculation when revision was still manageable. The white scar on the canyon walls at Lake Mead is what happens when the reckoning for that decision finally arrives, and there is nothing left to do except watch the waterline drop. The power problem nobody is talking about. Most people who watch footage of Hoover Dam think about water. The structure's most critical function in 2026 is not storing water, it is generating electricity. The dam's 17 hydroelectric generating units produce enough power for approximately 1.3 million American homes. That electricity flows into a grid serving Nevada, Arizona, and California. It powers hospitals, it runs water treatment facilities, it keeps the lights on in communities that have no immediate alternative source capable of replacing what Hoover Dam provides. Those generators require water pressure. As the lake surface drops, the pressure driving water through the dam's intake tunnels and turbines decreases. Less pressure means less generating capacity, and that relationship is not linear. It accelerates as the lake drops. The minimum elevation at which Hoover Dam can generate any power at all, what engineers call the Deadpool threshold, sits at 895 feet above sea level. Lake Mead is currently at approximately 1,049 feet. That means the water surface is 154 feet above the level at which the generators go silent, and the downstream flow that 7 states legally depend on simply stops. 154 feet. That sounds like a substantial margin until you understand the rate of decline. The Bureau of Reclamation is projecting a 20-foot drop in Lake Mead's elevation before the end of the 2026 water year. Snowpack across the upper basin is at 9% of its seasonal average as of this week. The spring and early summer inflow that should be refilling the reservoir is the lowest on record. 154 feet of margin at a projected rate of decline of 20 or more feet per year is not an abstract future concern. It is an arithmetic problem with a timeline measured in years, not decades. Dead pool conditions would mean Hoover Dam stops generating power entirely. The dam cannot release any water downstream. The 7 states that signed the 1922 compact and built their cities and farms on its promises would receive nothing. The international treaty obligating the United States to deliver 1.5 million acre-feet of water annually to Mexico would become impossible to honor. The most visible and iconic piece of water infrastructure in American history would become an empty concrete arch in a dry canyon. Engineers at the Bureau of Reclamation are not saying Deadpool is imminent. What they are saying is that it is now within the range of scenarios that require active planning rather than dismissal. That is a statement that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. The domino that cannot be stopped. Lake Powell sits immediately upstream from Lake Mead behind Glen Canyon Dam in northern Arizona. The 2 reservoirs function as a connected system. When Powell drops, it releases less water to Mead. When Mead drops, there is no downstream buffer to absorb Powell's own deficit. Lake Powell is currently projected to reach a new record low elevation in 2026, surpassing the previous record set in 2023. The Colorado River Basin's dual reservoir system was designed to hold a combined buffer of nearly 50 million acre-feet. The 2 reservoirs together currently hold approximately 9 million acre-feet. The safety margin built into the system over 90 years of dam construction and water management has been consumed. What remains is not a buffer. It is operating inventory, and it is being drawn down every day. Outflows exceed inflows. The Imperial Valley of California produces more than 80% of America's winter vegetables. Those farms draw Colorado River allocations. California holds senior water rights, meaning its allocations are theoretically protected, but senior rights in a river that can no longer honor all obligations simultaneously are theoretical entitlements in a very real drought. The Colorado River stopped reaching the Gulf of California reliably in the 1990s. The river that carved the Grand Canyon now runs out before it reaches the sea, consumed entirely by the farms, cities, and infrastructure built along its banks. The white scar on the canyon walls at Hoover Dam is the visible record of that consumption. 170 feet of water that went into the system served its purpose and never came back. The Bureau of Reclamation is currently modeling 4 operational scenarios for the Colorado River system through 2030. 3 of those 4 scenarios project Lake Mead dropping below 1,000 feet elevation within 36 months. The 4th, labeled optimistic in internal documents, requires 3 consecutive above-average snowpack years beginning immediately. The last time the Upper Colorado River Basin recorded 3 consecutive above-average snowpack years was between 2018 and 2019. This winter delivered 9% of average snowpack. The forecast for the remainder of the 2026 water year shows no pattern shift capable of reversing the deficit before the summer heat consumes what little snow remains. Emergency water shortage tiers that federal water managers never expected to activate are now being discussed in terms of when rather than if. Cities are accelerating investment in desalination, water recycling, and groundwater recharge programs that require years to build and billions to fund. The white scar on the canyon walls keeps climbing. The projections keep narrowing. 170 feet. That is the distance between where the water was and where the water is. That is the accumulated record of 26 years of drought, a century of overallocation, warming temperatures that are stealing the snowpack before it can melt into the river, and a political system that has consistently chosen not to confront the gap between what was promised in 1922 and what the river can actually deliver. The dam still stands. The water still flows through it for now. The generators still turn for now. But the canyon walls do not lie, and the numbers do not bend. The white ring is a measurement. It measures what was taken, what did not return, and how much further the surface has to fall before the generators go quiet and the river stops reaching the cities it built. That measurement is 170 feet today. It will be larger tomorrow. The question is not whether Lake Mead continues to fall. The data answers that. The question is whether the people who depend on it will act before the arithmetic finishes what the drought started.